Discover the power of music to heal and uplift. Introducing NeuroVibe, where rhythm meets recovery. NeuroVibe fuses ambient music textures with rhythmic layers to create music that goes beyond relaxation. It's crafted to resonate deeply, perfect for relaxation, self-reflection, or therapeutic sessions. NeuroVibe invites you to connect with your inner self through immersive sound. Explore NeuroVibe today on SoundCloud and experience the transformative power of music. Tune in, find your vibe, and discover what NeuroVibe can do for you. For more information, check out NeuroVibe on SoundCloud today at soundcloud.com/NeuroVibe-brainspotting. NeuroVibe is intended for general wellness and relaxation purposes and is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Explore NeuroVibe now on SoundCloud. Dive in, find your rhythm, and feel better with NeuroVibe.
Welcome to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered with Perry Clark. This program looks at mental health from unique perspectives and shows you how to manage your life by finding the knots that help you and stay away from the ones that could be a disadvantage. Now, here is your host, Perry Clark.
Hello all, welcome to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist here with you, and this is going to be another TheraBlerdOut, as I also have my lovely co-blurter, Dr. Mercedes Samudio, doctor of social work and licensed clinical social worker, who's also centered on shame-proof parenting. But if you've heard any of our other ones, you know where to find her, and her information will be in the show notes. But we want to spend that time getting into what we're here to talk about. But I also got to put the disclaimer in. This podcast does not count as a therapeutic or services. It is for education and informational purposes. So please seek out a therapist in your area and make sure to find a therapist that works for you and fits with you, because frankly, not every therapist is always going to be the best bet. I say that, and I'm also going to put this, that we are post-election here. Find the people that work, that allow for you to be in the vulnerability you need to heal. So, getting into that standpoint, let's talk about Agatha All Along, which I know we're recording this well after the show is finished, but that also gives us some time to reflect and think about it. So welcome, Mercedes, and let's get into this.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I loved this show. And I'll say this at the top of it. As I have been really paying attention and rewatching some of the Marvel television now, you notice it's Marvel television now. I love that. They've really been laying into all of the mythology and the groundwork that we're going to be needing, I think, for the next phase of Marvel shows. But what I mean, our Marvel TV, our Marvel films, rather. But what I loved about Agatha is that it continued the discussion on intersectionality, multiculturalism, this idea that there are more layers of humanity to explore. And so you have so much representation in this show, but it's representation in a way that's not like, look at me, we've got one of this and three of that. It is representation that shows what humans look like at their intersections, what humans look like when they are allowed to be full, not good, not bad, not right, not wrong, but like these full-bodied people. And that was something that at the top of this discussion, even as we get into plot points and characterizations, I really loved about Agatha. And I think it's continuing to do the same thing that Marvel television is doing, telling these really great stories that show intersectionality, that show multiculturalism, that are representative of full human beings.
Very much so. And I think to also add on to that is the aspect of the multiple levels and types of grief that exist.
Yeah, that's
because if in reality, you look at every single one of those characters in there, even not spoilers if you haven't watched it yet, but if you have, even death is dealing with a kind of grief too.
And that I think has been carried over from WandaVision, right? So those of you who were able to watch that, that show really showed Wanda's grief and her
Mm-hmm.
experience with it. But then she left Agatha kind of in it, if you will. We didn't really
Mm-hmm.
get a moment to understand her. She was kind of that bad guy who was
Mm-hmm.
orchestrating it all. And in Agatha All Along, you're right, we get this expansiveness of what does grief really look like, not just through Agatha's grief, but kind of, and again, spoilers again, through all of this grief, she has kind of led a trail of herself through some of the coven that she's worked with, the things that she's done to them, right? Her
Mm-hmm.
own grief almost paralleled what Wanda did, where when Wanda's grief made her entrap a whole community of people,
Mm-hmm.
Agatha's grief made her just spend her life, hurting other people and harming
Mm-hmm.
other people, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. As well as the grief that each of the other members of the coven was living with too,
Yeah, yeah,
and how it
yeah.
influenced their choices.
Yeah, and their trials, right? Each of the trials that
Mm-hmm.
they had to really face that level of grief. One that I think continues to stand out, and it'll probably stand out for much of us, most of us who watch it, was Alice's grief, right? With her
Mm-hmm.
intergenerational trauma and thinking
Right.
that, her mom, had left her, but really her mom was trying to protect her in a sense. And she had to really face some of that intergenerational stuff, that generational stuff of what she thought her relationship was with her mom, what she
Mm-hmm.
thought her mom was doing, and how really she was also part of the healing process, right? And her being able to kind of defeat that metaphysical,
Mm-hmm.
that actual
That
grief that
harpy.
she was. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I love that piece of it. Who else's was I thinking of that was really blatant like that? Jennifer's. I'm gonna just go
Mm-hmm.
right to Jennifer's.
Yeah.
Again,
Which,
you're gonna be airing this way after, so please, I'm gonna say right now,
yeah.
spoilers. But watching Jennifer free herself as a Black woman myself, African American woman myself,
Mm-hmm.
you hold nothing has become a wonderful mantra for me, right?
Mm-hmm.
That I hold none of this. I don't hold
Mm-hmm.
these expectations. I don't hold this narrative, but I also don't hold that trauma. I don't hold everything that was tying me down. I mean, she
Mm-hmm.
literally flew away Virginia Hamilton like, right? The people could fly like she
Right.
just flew off once she was able to unbind herself from that binding that Agatha inadvertently, interestingly enough, put her in, which I think there's a
Mm-hmm.
there's a discussion
Oh,
there too.
which I think going back to Alice's character is like what we didn't get was the likelihood, which I really think is likely, is that Agatha is also the reason her family had that heart beyond them too.
Yes. I think that was true. I think that was very
We
true.
just didn't
And from
get that
following them.
particular, yeah, we just didn't get that particular point of where Agatha, again, in her not thinking about consequences beyond what was going on in the immediate, probably caused this curse for Alice's family.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah.
also then brings up the standpoint of how did she know so much about Alice in the first place?
And everyone, right? She was
Mm-hmm.
really aware of everyone's kind of issue, everyone's kind of problem, and almost it seemed as if she was constantly using it to neg
Mm-hmm.
them forward, constantly kind of twisting here or saying something snide there to get them to go forward with her. Almost
Mm-hmm.
like, and again, spoiler alert, almost like how her and her son created the song to
Mm-hmm.
lure people even within the road. You find that she uses that kind of tactic, right, to maneuver and to get the other witches in her coven to continue on with the trials.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That aspect of it's an element of manipulation, which
Yes.
Agatha is very good at, and that
Yes.
standpoint of reading people and working with desires and where our emotions much more towards the surface, which again we can see where there's other things going on in the non-Marvel world where people do use that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's something that is interesting that you bring that parallel to, because when we go into these fantasy worlds like Agatha or the Penguin or anything like that, we tend
Mm-hmm.
to understand villains really well, right? We tend to be able
Mm-hmm.
to understand their motives, we tend to empathize with them. And some might say that's an interesting thing because it makes us unaware of real life villains, right? We tend to empathize with them instead of hold them accountable. Or we
Hmm.
tend to think, well, you don't know the whole story instead of really understanding the level of destruction that this
Hmm.
manipulation or their kind of strategies can wreak on people. And I think that's something to
Hmm.
be said here because Agatha is a real villain the whole time, right? She's not redemptive. She's not on this redemptive arc. She
Hmm.
continues even until the very final moment when she's like,
Hmm.
here, her mindset is still on manipulation, even at the
Hmm.
very end, right? And that's something that I think we need to pay attention to, as you mentioned, that real life parallel of sometimes I think people just have this and they just feel the need that this is the only way to live. And people sometimes can't really discern what that looks like, I think
Hmm.
sometimes.
Well, even that standpoint, not just discern, is that also when it is, and this also gets in back into the grief because there's also the element of um, who embodied which of the different stages of grief too,
Mm.
and the standpoint that denial is probably one of the biggest and most difficult ones to get through. Not necessarily depression, but denial, because denial will feed into the ego, and denial, once it's feeding into the ego, it becomes so protective that it will cause you to deny reality,
Yes. Yes. And we
deny
saw
the
that.
consequences of things.
And I think we saw that with each person's grief. It was
Hmm.
hard for them. Alice didn't want to, acknowledge her relationship with her mom. Jennifer, refused at any given time to use power to even step back into magic.
Hmm.
Agatha even very agonizingly refused to face the grief of losing her child, right? Let's be real. Billy refused to, manage the fact that he lost his brother, and was constantly
Hmm.
looking for him. And so that grief caused each of these people, what was her name? Patty LaPone's character,
Oh,
Lilia.
Lilia, yeah.
Yeah, she refused to accept her fate, that she could see forwards and backwards, kind of her own fate. And so I think you have all these characters who were grieving, like you said, and that grief was kind of obscuring their vision. They were having a hard time facing things, hard time facing the
Hmm.
truth, so much that kind of the road made
Hmm.
them metaphysically kind of face, if you will.
Which, as again, spoilers, this is also the place where the power that Wanda used as a Scarlet Witch is also the percentage of power that Billy has, especially because it looks like he's a telepath witch,
Yes.
um, in the aspect of what was created with the road itself.
Yeah. So he kind of did the same thing his mom did.
Hmm.
Um, what I love that parallel again, yeah, I keep saying spoiler alert, but I like saying it because
Yeah,
it's fun,
it's
right?
still spoiler
But
alert of this one.
right,
Yeah.
right. But what Wanda did was from her childhood of watching sitcoms and American TV,
Hmm.
her thing that she pulled people in was to that weekly episodic TV
Hmm.
show format.
Hmm.
But for Billy, Billy had a different childhood. He grew up with different people. I saw his Buffy poster, I saw
Hmm.
his Wizard of Oz, figurines.
Hmm.
And so what you end up having on the
Well,
road,
again, spoilers. We have to put a
sorry.
Billy, the real Billy, and the step in Billy,
Yes. Thank you.
who
Thank
had
you.
to
Thank you.
essentially establish himself in essentially another person's body, another person's life, another person's
Yes. Yes.
what now becomes the orienting things for him, like Buffy, like the Wizard of Oz.
Yes. Thank you for that. Thank you for that crosswalk there, right?
Yeah.
That now this Billy who is realizing who he is and what his powers are, and that he's essentially, again, spoiler alert, folks, cover your ears, is a Maximoff. He
Hmm.
realizes that he did the same thing that she did. He pulled in what he could see and made kind of this space for him, or made the space for everyone else. And
Hmm.
there's an intricacy here that, as clinicians, I want to think about because this is almost what trauma looks like. That
Hmm.
when people go into these spaces, I think what WandaVision and Agatha All Along has done is kind of visualized what happens to people. But when you go into these mental spaces and you're replaying trauma, you kind of do bring in the things you are connected with or you're familiar with. You bring in the TV show dad who would say it the right way, or you bring in the cool setting so you could do it the way you want to be able to do it. You make all of your friends go down the witch's road because you want to make sure that we're going to deal with this, each of us, right? It's a very interesting way that the writers have kind of visualized or illustrated what happens when we are experiencing grief and when that kind of we're trying to get ourselves out of that grief, or we're trying to figure out who we are after that grief, if that makes sense.
Which and beyond that point of, it's also something that a lot of us are now facing with in the real world. And I admit that one of the things that has come up in some of the ways I've had to give analogies is with everything that's happened, both between the grief that's happened in the larger world to what we're seeing also in the storyline in Agatha, is the aspect of sooner or later you find yourself in a trap. And as has been found not just in our four-legged furry brethren, but as has been shown by other humans, if you have to cut that arm off, you have to cut that limb off to survive, you'll do it. But it doesn't mean you're getting that limb back. Your world has changed. You have to accept what that limb is no longer there and make forward from that. And each one of them in their own way is also, what is the thing that limb has to go if they're going to keep living?
Yes, there's this space that I'm thinking as you talk about it, that becomes visualized kind of in those trials where there's these pieces of them that they have cut off from them. Like for Lilia, she's cut off her ability to stay present because she's going backwards and forwards. Or for Alice, she's cut off her ability to find her strength because she was so hell-bent on ignoring her mom and her mom's strength. Even for Jennifer Kale, like she ignored her ability to actually be a conjurer and to be an actual witch because she was like, no, they took it from me. I can't have it anymore. And so
and the fact that her knowledge remained. Her knowledge remained as well. She always had her knowledge.
Yes, she did. They couldn't take that away from her, right? But yes, there's this idea that there are pieces of you that are gone that you have to live with now. How do you do that? I think that's exactly what you're kind of getting at, or that's what that's what was coming up for me as you were sharing that, this idea that, yeah, you have something missing. There's a void there. There's a space there. There's a limb gone, right? There's something that's gone. And will I get it back? Or do I have to live now with that space not being occupied?
Right. Which I think also feeds back into that sense of that, what I'm saying about the denial and gets tied in the ego is that, oh, you can always get it back. Maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, and it stops you from moving forward because you're sitting here waiting. It's coming back.
Or you're spending all your energy trying to get it back, let alone moving forward.
Right, right. And I think that's something that when we think about grief and its non-linear process, I noticed this happen kind of in the trials, that people would come, that, one of them would come to the trial and there'd be this moment of hesitation, this moment of, I don't have what it takes to do this, whatever that might be, whether it be do the right musical number or mix the right potion or figure out the clues in the room the right way, and how each trial forced them, challenge them to say, this. Almost, you had Agatha actually doing it off to the side quite a bit. She'd be like, you know how to do this. During the tarot card one, right? She's making fun of how silly tarot is, but at the same time, egging Lilia to hurry up and, assess, what is this? What's coming next? How is this going to go? And so I find that there's this parallel as we're talking about grief, that when someone is trying to grieve or when someone has lost a piece of themselves, there might be an Agatha-like character that forces them out of it, who's trying to tell them, get over it. You have the power. You don't need them, right? And that sometimes can be overwhelming to have someone in your ear telling you when to get through it for their own benefit, usually.
Right. And I think, and in that same line is also the standpoint of, you cannot do that alone. As is in the fact that, Even though it had been built as a long con,
Yeah.
Agatha needed a coven. She needed people to be in relationship with. She also knew she didn't have all the skills. Literally, she
Yeah.
did not have the skills. She didn't know how to do the healing ritual that Jennifer did that saved Billy. She
Mhm.
didn't have the ability to read those tarot cards.
Yep. Yep.
She didn't reach out to do the protection spell that Alice did.
There you go.
And of course, again, not wanting to get too much into our green witch and death, is like there's certain things that even there she couldn't, and that was shown by giving us some of her backstory. She can't defy that, but she has to have a
Yeah.
relationship. She has to have a relationship with it, like all of us do,
Wow.
because it's
I
always going to be
love
coming
that.
to us.
I love that because as you were going through each person's, and I appreciate that you keep bringing up the green witch that is death, right? Because death
Mm-hmm.
becomes this beginning and this end, right? I think there is this space here that you're bringing up for me that Agatha needed all of these people as well. I think there's a
Mm-hmm.
part of her that thought, I only need them to open the road. I only need them to get to the end of the road. But even in her own grief, these folks going through it themselves, she needed that too. She needed that community of people to help her finally come to terms with her grief and what had happened to her centuries ago.
Mm-hmm. Let alone for her to have power, because she the best way I can think of it, and I'm sure there's other things actually in the comic book universe that would describe it and so forth, but she was a dead power cell. And that was the thing
Mm.
that Wanda had succeeded in doing, was cutting her, not so much cutting her off from her power, but allowing her to deplete,
Ah, yeah.
which sort of becomes, as we start running, understanding the long con she's doing, she's basically always juicing herself up to have power off of the other witches that she tricks along with the belief of the road.
Correct, 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 correct. And in this moment, like you said, she kind of allowed herself to just kind of deplete and not have all that power and not suck the life out of this moment or
Mm-hmm.
this thing. And I think that goes back to kind of what we do when we are trying to protect ourselves from the grief, from the intensity of it. For Agatha, she used the witch's road or the myth of the witch's road to keep her son alive in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
but in doing so, she was also keeping herself from that grief of losing him and finally putting him to rest
Mm-hmm.
by taking other people, taking from other people, kind of metaphorically, like her son was taken from her, right? Her
Mm-hmm.
son being her power and her source of light, and he was taken away from her by death, right? By the Green Witch. And so, in a
Mm-hmm.
sense, she keeps him alive by singing the song, teaching the song, allowing people to do it. And that's what he did. He sung, he brought people to them, and so
Mm-hmm.
she sung and brought people to them and then would take from them, I think, the way that she was taken from. And I think that's a very interesting thing that I'm coming to now as we're starting to talk about what we do to protect ourselves from grief or the intense emotions that grief brings up.
Mm-hmm. Or to the standpoint of those who will threaten our sense of self-preservation.
Ooh, yeah,
Because
yeah.
again, because of what looks like the nature of Agatha's power, she was always considered a threat by the other witches.
Yes, yes. That episode was so powerful when her mom showed up and told her, you know,
Mm-hmm.
I wish that you hadn't been here. Like, think about that
Mm-hmm.
grief too, because that grief happened to her before she even became a mother herself, right? So
Right.
for her own mother to reject her, her own mother to say, you are not what I wanted, or you were a monster, right? To
Mm-hmm.
hear that and to know that she was living with that after
Mm-hmm.
again, and from that, she ended up killing, murdering her coven, from all of that grief, from all of that trauma, right? Her power kind of wasn't oh, this is interesting. I'm coming to it. Her power wasn't supported. Her power was feared and threatened, right? And
Right.
so I think she went into that even as a mother, right? That she taught her child how to lure people, not how to come into contact and community with people, but she
Mm-hmm.
ended up teaching her and her son ended up learning how to lure people to kind of fake community because her initial community, her mom and her initial community of covens kind of rejected her. And so she's been living with
Mm-hmm.
that grief for years.
Right. Which is, I think, also in a very bigger issue too about the idea that how much how much the world has been built as a very life-centered place.
Mm.
Her magic, as far as we've been able to be told, is connected with spirit and death.
Mm.
Counter to the standpoint of everything's about life. And how, again, we vilify death.
Yes, but we
When it
do. We
is
definitely do.
a very necessary thing in the world, and it's something, again, we all have a relationship with it. Not sometimes it's a very distant relationship, and sometimes it becomes closer and closer till it's sitting next to us.
And I appreciate you sharing that because I feel like that's kind of what Aubrey Plaza ends up being, right? She ends
Mm-hmm.
up being this real personification of death in the mist. She never leaves. The minute she enters the coven, the minute she enters the road, at every trial, she's cackling, she's
Mm-hmm.
laughing. God, that laugh. Aubrey Plaza really
Mm-hmm.
should just get an award for that laugh. Right? She's so
Mm-hmm.
good. But you're right, death kind of is always present for them. And in the sense that that's always there, right? It's always a part of our life. Death is always something that sometimes cackles at us and sometimes is
Mm-hmm.
just there with us. But even that last piece that you said, that sometimes death just scoots up to us and is right there, right? That's kind of her and Agatha's relationship. They actually had a
Mm-hmm.
relationship. It wasn't just a metaphorical relationship. Like they were lovers, they were together. And so death really was right up on and next to Agatha for much of her life.
Mm-hmm. Which ties into that aspect of you're going to be able to speak to the dead. Guess what you're going to have? Death is one of the things essentially that controls that aspect. She's going to have a relationship with death.
There you go.
And here we find out, well, they were, and yeah, intimately, she's going to be intimately connected with death. Well, here's the personification of it. Now, mind you, and this is again getting to the comic universe, once that became clear, it's like, so is this now going to be a three-way between Death, Thanos, and Deadpool? Because they all got a relationship with Lady Death in the comics. And it's just like, oh man, the fight for that one.
Right, right. But I kind of appreciate that because, again, that goes back into this idea of death being something we all have to manage. And I know a bit about that kind of. Thanos actually got the stones in the comic for death
Mm-hmm.
only to impress her, right? I know they completely changed
The
that in.
original comic
Yeah.
version versus what we saw in Endgame and Infinity War.
Yes. Yes, exactly. And so think about that, right? That I think death for many of us is something that feels that big. It feels that scary. It feels like something only bad people would have a relationship with. And I
Mm-hmm.
think we have to really face the fact that with death also comes life. With
Mm-hmm.
death also comes grief and intensity. And as a clinician, I'll even say this in the mental health world, with death also comes release. There are times
Mm-hmm.
when people lose people that had a hold on them while they were alive, and their death, while shocking and maybe grieving, also becomes a release of this person now
Mm-hmm.
from them. And so I think that aspect of death we don't often talk about because we
No.
often think about grief and death and it being someone that we really cared about. But oftentimes people pass or die who it kind of releases us from their control and it releases us from
Mm-hmm.
what they had on us, whether that
Mm-hmm.
be a physical control or a mental, emotional control. But I think it's something
Mm-hmm.
that death in this show really kind of personifies, as you shared, this idea that death is kind of always present with us at every trial. It's right up with us, and many of us have a hard time getting connected to it and getting intimately involved with it because it is so scary and it is so big of a concept to think about.
Mm-hmm. And death is also sitting there with us when we're having those wonderful moments, and even it is laughing with us.
Yeah, yeah,
Because
yeah.
there does come a point where even as the Green Witch, they do feel a connection, and the others do feel a connection with her as a group. And it's not in that moment of where she's purposely trying to continue the cycle of life and all of that, but is that there's a point where death is also on some level a friend to them. I mean,
Yeah.
cursory at the beginning because there isn't a lot of time for that development to happen, but it's there.
Yeah. And when you think about that, think about how much these people have lost. So for like someone like Lilia, who sees her own death, death is with her. Someone like Jen, where she has lost her sense of self. There's that death of self, or that death of our own power, right? That she had to kind of come to power with, or come to understanding with. Tommy, Billy, ha ha ha. I'm going ahead of myself. With Billy, he had that death twice, right? He had the death where he literally died when he got erased out of time, but then he also died, right? And kind of came into a new self and had to figure out who he was. And so he's come into contact with death, and he lost his brother, right? And so I think everyone, and then, Alice lost her mom. She's dealt with death, but never grieved because she didn't have a relationship with her mom. So she never grieved it. And then we also know Agatha has had a lot of death in her life. And so as you share that death is with us, for each person who was on the road, there was this relationship with death that they hadn't really connected with, whether it be a physical death of someone they cared about, or a more internal death of their identity or of their power.
And so the multiple different levels of it. But I think that's a great place for us to take a break here. So stay tuned. We're going to continue talking about Agatha All Along here and our TheraBlerding Out here on Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with Dr. Mercedes Samudio. So stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back.
Voice America is on LinkedIn. Connect with us today.
Our lives and the world around us can get messy and frustrating. Untangle and Grow Counseling's focus is to untangle that mess and make sense of it, so you have a good foundation to build and grow from. Visit us on the web at untangleandgrowcounseling.com. Perry Clark offers individual psychotherapy, couples and family therapy, and adolescence therapy from a variety of coping materials and resources. Visit untangleandgrowcounseling.com for more information.
Discover the power of music to heal and uplift. Introducing NeuroVibe, where rhythm meets recovery. NeuroVibe fuses ambient music textures with rhythmic layers to create music that goes beyond relaxation. It's crafted to resonate deeply, perfect for relaxation, self-reflection, or therapeutic sessions. NeuroVibe invites you to connect with your inner self through immersive sound. Explore NeuroVibe today on SoundCloud and experience the transformative power of music. Tune in, find your vibe, and discover what NeuroVibe can do for you. For more information, check out NeuroVibe on SoundCloud today at soundcloud.com/NeuroVibe-brainspotting. NeuroVibe is intended for general wellness and relaxation purposes and is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Explore NeuroVibe now on SoundCloud. Dive in, find your rhythm, and feel better with NeuroVibe.
Follow us on Twitter for more great ideas at Voice America Empowerment.
You are listening to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. If you have a question or comment about our podcast, send an email to pclark@untyingknotspodcast.com. That's pclark@untyingknotspodcast.com. And now, back to the program.
Hello all, welcome back to Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. I'm Perry Clark, licensed marriage and family therapist, here with Dr. Mercedes Samudio. And we're having our TheraBlerding Out as we're talking about Agatha All Along. So one of the things, as we were just checking in during our break here, one of the things I knew I wanted to talk about was also the aspect of what happened with the sigil, which again, spoiler alert, for those who haven't watched it yet, there comes a point where Billy cannot speak about himself in a certain way, because at some point everyone else either suddenly loses volume or it looks like he's mumbling, like his mouth has been tied. And we come to find out that that was done on purpose. And we find out by whom. And at which point their response is both feeling sorry for what they've done, but also that statement of, you needed time. And that comes in with the aspect of Billy, both Billies, stepping in to this new other Billy's life and now needing to orient himself there.
Yeah.
And to begin to start sensing who he is. But that can't happen if he's kind of already worrying about where is Tommy, where is all of these other things as the power of witchdom.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think you hit on that point too, that Lilia is kind of this group member who seems very kooky and weird at first, right? She's saying random things at different points in time, and we come to find out that she really does have this wisdom of kind of knowing backwards and forwards through time what's going to happen. And so I think there comes this piece of, even for Lilia, she had to kind of come to terms with, she's known who this person was since the first time she's met him. But she, even with her lack of awareness, or I won't even say that, I think her inability to connect to her power and her divination skills, it caused her to not only make a really healthy choice when she was aware of herself, but when she gets disconnected or she dissociates, she's disconnected from that point of herself. And so I kind of appreciated that in her ability to be present with herself, she did give Billy that time to figure himself out, right? But she did it in a way that I think all of us are used to, right? We sometimes feel silenced. We sometimes feel like we can't speak about ourselves or for ourselves. And I appreciated that that was done in a way that showed it was for Billy's benefit, because oftentimes it's done in a way to silence us. It's done in a way for us not to talk, right? And for Billy, this time, it was done in a way to help him come to terms with the fact that you are now another person. You're still like William, but you've got the soul of Billy. And it's like such a really weird thing here that I think, outside of the context of a fantasy TV show, what I see here is someone coming to terms with their identity and another adult in their life having the wisdom to say, give him the space to do that.
Which is also a very big thing, going back to our theme of grief here, that comes up when we have an experience of loss, whether it is at the actual death of a loved one, whether it's a divorce, and I also go into, even if it's a change in jobs, it's a standpoint of where we have to adjust to either returning to something we were before, which was that person we still always had a life. And I say this even when I'm talking to couples, is like, you had a life before this person, you had a life with this person, you're going to have a life after this person, but you're going to have to start figuring out what that is. And that's the same thing, again, when we actually lose someone to death, when we have a relationship breakup and we've essentially lose the connections to all the people that are in a web connection with them, to all the connections we lose and the sense of identity when we leave a job position, or it's time for us to migrate out of a job position and identity.
Yes. And I think this is the piece of it that we ignore. We listen to people's grief when they've lost something tangible that we can see. But when people lose a sense of their identity or a sense of their family or their community, that's something that I think is too ambiguous for people. It doesn't have a tangible space to it. And so people don't always understand that, like with Billy, he lost his whole family and his whole identity, right? And so it's like, how do you come to terms with that when it's not tangible? I can't touch my loss of identity. I can just sense my loss of self.
Which is also a larger blind spot and place that also denial gets to run rampant with, when we're looking at that issue on even larger scales or day-to-day scales, that if it is not a tangible thing, it is hard for people to understand what is. And let's be frank, that's one of the biggest struggles we have with the subject of mental health.
Yes.
If it is not bleeding, if it is not some sort of massive gashing, obvious wound that we can shove gauze into, it's struggle for anyone to actually understand what it is unless you've also gone through it.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, on that note, I think that's kind of what's become unfortunate about mental health because oftentimes, in order to showcase things, people have to show symptoms or enact certain things or present a certain way. So then I have to present to you what my depression is. I have to present to you what my grief is. And oftentimes, people don't fit those neat, you know, categories that the DSM has. And so this is what grief is, and this is what depression is.
Right.
We don't always fit that. And so I think you're right. In this haste to make something tangible that we can see, we've almost kind of ignored that a lot of what we experience can't be quantified or qualified. You know what I'm saying? We can't put it in a series of symptoms and then call it something, right? What we're experiencing.
Which is the limit of the DSM and the fact that it grew out of the medical model of syndromes and symptoms and so forth versus, again, life.
Yeah. Yeah. So then you have people here who can't really see grief outside of it being someone physically passing, right? Not to see it where it's like, I actually lost a sense of who I am when, you know, the person hasn't passed. They just left, or we got a divorce, like you said, or I changed, you know, jobs. There's no physical loss, but there is a kind of spiritual loss, if you will, an inner loss that people can't always see.
An energetic loss. And even the idea that you change jobs, or let's say you were fired and you found another job, that you're not living with that resentment and that anger that came from, why did you have to leave that other job? When it was, again, wasn't your choice. And even then, it's also, again, coming back to that sense of where is even the culture didn't match. I mean, yeah, you may be great at that job and that work, but that culture of that place did not work. And that, again, comes back into how did Agatha fit into the culture of witchdom versus the culture of the rest of the world?
Yeah, yeah. And then now we're talking about what witches mean in the rest of the world too, right? That the culture of witchcraft, the idea of witches has always been something so demonized and ostracized, right? And then you deal with each of these characters who lives in a world where even when we meet Jennifer, she's doing like, you know, the self-help kind of, you know, thing, because that's the way that people see magic, or that's the way that people see that type of stuff. Lilia was doing, you know, divination in a tent, you know, at, you know.
Yeah, she was the storefront psychic.
Right, exactly, right? Because this is how people see this identity, right? And so think about the grief and the loss of yourself, where each of these women were or each of these people rather were really witches and had real power, but the world did not see it as that and had completely erased that historical understanding of that power to the fact that these people didn't know who they were. Lilia couldn't connect with herself. Jen couldn't connect with herself. Alice had completely rejected that aspect of herself, right?
Which,
think about that grief.
Which, speaking to that aspect, and again, identity, even with what happens to Alice's character, is that standpoint of she's a protector. And it may not seem like it. She went down protecting somebody. And that's one of the things that even death had to show her. In the series is like, you did go to your purpose. You fulfilled your purpose. And now it's time for whatever comes after.
Which is such a powerful message, to fulfill your purpose. And what does that mean? Right. Which I appreciate here, because I think that's something that I'm okay with, sitting with the uncertainty of it, because it's like, I don't actually know what it means to fulfill your purpose, because once you fulfill it, you will have done it. Right. And so it just feels very very uncertain to me to think about that. And I appreciate this show kind of giving us an illustration through Alice of what it looks like if you are a protector, if you're someone who has this heading in life. What does it look like to accept your heading, to do it, and then to kind of die physically and metaphorically doing your purpose in life? Like, what does that look like? I appreciate that visualization of it.
Right. Which also then gets into one of the bigger issues, the standpoint of how some people have allowed, especially the protector identity, to become so ingrained in themselves that they can't have anything else.
That's a good one. That's a good one that we definitely have to kind of look at.
And it is also, but it's not just that shows up there, it shows up in every part of the MCU, even the DCU. It shows up in every single one of this, any type of hero story, even to the stuff we see with the boys, in the standpoint of that identity and role has become so massively ingrained, you can't have something else. You can't be part of something else because it's so believed that you have to be this.
Yeah. I think that is something that then happened to Alice. So she died being a protector, right? She got to live her life though. And I give her that. Like she kind of got away from it a little bit. But I think in coming back to her true purpose, right? We got to see her do this. And I think something that I'll say here, I think paying attention to the fact that there is a beginning, a middle, and end to all of our lives is something that we've been talking about, which is, I think that's why death was such a huge part of it. Even death being there as Alice passed to say, I'm going to help you come through this moment so that way you can see that you have done the fullness of it, right? That connection to me, whether we talk about living your protector for your whole life or whatnot, I think we have to still go back with what we've been saying, which is death is part of our whole life, and we all probably will end up dying. Will we have lived the life that we wanted to live? Will we have served the purpose that we were here for? Will we have done that? That's kind of what I saw in that ending space of Alice got to do it. She got to live her life and serve that purpose, and death was able to show her that.
Which
that's
is
my whimsy of it.
Yeah, which is not always something that happens, and I think sometimes is what we also do in therapy too.
Allow people to get to
people
that.
see it without having to be put on the lovely outfits of death. She was rocking a number of those outfits.
She was amazing. I'll say this as we talk. And I know we kind of are coming towards the end here. I want to just give a shout out to everyone in that cast. I think everyone really did an amazing job personifying and bringing forth what it meant to exist at this level of grief, at this intersection of their social location, even to showcase that whole journey. And so for me, I really appreciated Jennifer being in that space as a Black woman who found her power. I just want to give a huge shout out to Shashir Zamata. She was amazing. And thank you for your amazing portrayal of Jen. I just want that to be out there in the podcast world.
Well, let's also get into one of the other things that is another of the natures of dealing with grief and death is being forgotten.
Oof,
and there was, quote unquote, Mrs. Hart, aka Sharon.
Who?
Sharon.
Right. I really appreciate that though, because Sharon came over from WandaVision. Right. And she was a huge piece of that. She was in every episode almost. And for her to still be here, for her to be going along with it, I'd even say for Westview to still kind of have to be in this. Because when they started out, Westview was still playing along with Agatha's Agnes and Westview procedural TV show, you know? And so I feel like Sharon kind of personified almost that forgotten piece of trauma that happened in WandaVision, where people almost forgot that Wanda did this to the people of Westview already. And then she left Agatha there still in that space where everyone in Westview, as they said, once it came, for Rich 2, they were just going along with her as she was doing her procedural stuff. They weren't in the space anymore. And since they had gotten over, right, their grief, the event had already happened for them. Well, not completely, but the event had happened.
Found a way to live with it.
Yeah. And Agatha was still living in it.
Yeah. To the point of when the battle goes down at the end of this show, it was like, what else are we going to have to watch now? Is it happening again?
Is it happening?
Which again, so goes back into what we're seeing in the real world in the aspect of we've got to go through this again.
Now, isn't that art imitating life for you, right? And that looking at them say that was really hard for me.
Yeah, the fact that this was all filmed before we got to this particular point in time is like, got to do this again.
Yeah. But I think that's kind of why I appreciated Sharon being here, because it was kind of like this memory that this person has already gone through it. Sharon already went through that, right? She was part of the whole WandaVision thing. And then they kind of looped her into the witch's road. And then the poor woman passed and like actually ended up dying. So it wasn't fake, right? She ended up dying. And I think that that's something that if I wanted to share a piece of amazing writing, I think that shows again that sometimes we forget that people are still in their trauma. They're just trying to live. I think Sharon was just trying to go along with it. Like you said, the residents of Rescue were just trying to go along with it. They were just trying to say, maybe this is over, to get to the point where, again, watching Agatha and Death fight to feel like, is this another thing that's happening to us? Will we ever get out of this cycle? Will anything ever change?
Which is why I say the mental health aspects in the MCU universe is just massively why more people aren't literally dealing with it.
They need a therapist. I'm just going to say that right now. Y'all need to write a therapist into Westview, into some version of this, because these people need some support.
Well, it's not just Westview. I mean, just the entire freaking planet universe after the blip. But that since that, and it was very admitted that once we started hearing Sharon's stories, like she's still dealing with the grief of her husband because of what happened during WandaVision and the fact that Wanda's own grief had an impact on everybody else. The universe didn't stop and she wasn't in just isolation. It wasn't just Wanda, but because of what was going on for her, she couldn't see that.
Yeah. And that's something that I'll give the MCU. The MCU has really created this universe where people are dealing with the consequences of superheroes. They're dealing with the consequences of supervillains. They're dealing with the fact that like Sokovia really was an actual place that got completely destroyed. These are real places. Westview was a real place that Wanda just decided, here, I'm going to do my thing here. And so I kind of can't wait to see how or if the MCU deals with that, because I think there's a lot of people that have been harmed as a result of the Avengers doing stuff, the superheroes randomly having all of this power, but not having the emotional capacity to manage all of that power. And what does that do to the people around them?
Which is actually how we got introduced officially to Wakanda.
Through that grief and loss.
Right. Which is why, as I was talking to a friend when first Black Panther movie came out, is like, if you actually go back and watch the Winter Soldier storyline, you're watching T'Challa's story with grief and vengeance and so forth that we get later on with Killmonger.
Yep.
Which then
you're right.
Which then also creates the problem, though, is like, where then does T'Challa not deal with that aspect of he can understand what Killmonger is going through, as opposed to this is just completely wiped out. But I mean, there were other things going on. I'm not going to deny that. But that sense thereof is like there was an entire other level of connection that was missed. And again, design, storyline, materials, what do they have to keep going on for the MCU universe? Such as like, as somebody else would also point out, they weren't as thrilled with Agatha, but I had to point out certain things had to be played out because they're building for the Young Avengers. But that's another story. That's another episode altogether.
Yeah. But what I will say is I think what you're harping on is how much the MCU has not dealt with the fallout of people losing things. So I'll even, people losing their family, people losing their whole communities, people losing, their lives. It'll be interesting as we move into like Brave New World and Thunderbolts and all of those things. And maybe Young Avengers, right? Maybe we'll get a Young Avengers movie or lineup, or they'll show up. Are these people now going to have to deal with the consequences of the first kind of era of superheroes and all the stuff that they've dealt with? But you're right, that's a whole other episode. That's like its own episode, right? To talk about the legacy of these characters.
Which I think also then brings up one other element too, as we wrap up this talk about Agatha All Along, and even with what goes on to Billisy, is what is the legacy of grief and death?
What does it leave us with?
And what and how are people then building or not building and repeating the same mistakes all over again? The legacy.
or trying to build bridges and not repeat those mistakes again, trying to change
Mm-hmm.
things. What does that look like? I think that'll be something that will be interesting to see. And I'm going to go with the MCU of it because, like what we just said, people have that grief and loss, and how are they going to manage it? But then if you think about it globally, we've been making these real world parallels. It's a
Mm-hmm.
question for us to ask too, that in these moments of grief, in these moments of devastation, how does that change us? And then what do we do next?
Mm-hmm.
What's the legacy?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. I love that we ended with that because I think that's something to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because there's very easy to be caught up in the moment, but the legacy of this is something you do get a choice over.
Yes, yes, yes.
So contemplate that, folks, if and where you can. And I want to thank you for sitting in for another episode here of Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered, this TheraBlerding Out. And thank you, Mercedes, for coming on and doing another episode with me.
Always. It's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
All right. So stay tuned as we're going to have at least one, because when this airs, it'll be December. So I know I got one more episode left before we wrap up 2024 and we move into 2025 and what it will hold for all of us. So plan to be here as long as I can and as long as there's an option. So stay tuned, folks.
Thank you for tuning in for Untying Knots, Minds and Souls Untethered. Be sure to join your host, Perry Clark, for another episode on the podcast coming soon on the Voice America Empowerment Channel.